There is a specific kind of person who has already imagined the end. Not dramatically. Not with tears or theatrics. Just quietly, somewhere between waking and sleep. They've run the math on civilization and found it wanting. They've watched the news not with shock, but with a slow nod, as if waiting for the world to confirm what they already knew. You know what the temperature will be in 40 years. You know what the debt figures say. You know the half-life of hope in a political cycle. And yet, here you are. Still making coffee in the morning. Still laughing at something stupid a friend sent you. Still, in some quiet, embarrassing corner of yourself, caring about something. That contradiction? That's not confusion. That's not weakness. That is the specific, irreducible signature of the kind of person this is actually about. While the world calls you pessimistic, calls you nihilistic, calls you a bit much at parties. There's something nobody is talking about. The doomer path isn't a dead end. It is, for some people, the only honest road to something real. Let's go back a little. Think about the first time you understood that something you loved wasn't going to last. Maybe it was a place, a version of your family, a belief system that had held your world up for years. And then one day, quietly or all at once, it didn't. The people around you kept performing the rituals, kept saying the right words. And you were standing in the middle of it, completely alone in what you saw. That is where this begins. Not in cynicism. In clarity. There is a particular cognitive phenomenon, sometimes called depressive realism, where people who carry a certain quality of melancholy also carry something surprising, a more accurate perception of reality. Less prone to the optimism bias that keeps most people moving through their days without existential vertigo. You weren't broken when you started to see the cracks. You were paying attention. But here's what nobody tells the person who pays that kind of attention. The nervous system doesn't distinguish between your problem and humanity's problem. It processes a collapsing ecosystem the same way it processes a threat in the room. And so the body begins to live under the weight of something enormous. A grief so large it has no name, a dread so diffuse it has no cure. And the mind, in its profound adaptability, does what minds always do. It builds a philosophy around the wound. Carl Jung spoke of the shadow, the repository of everything we cannot face. Everything pushed below the surface because the surface demands that we function. But there's a shadow most people never discuss. The collective one. The cultural one. Some people become, without choosing it, psychically porous. Unusually sensitive to the unspoken grief of their time. They absorb what others deflect. They feel the weight of what the culture refuses to mourn. And because no one validates that feeling, they eventually stop trying to explain it. They go quiet. They go inward. They become fluent in irony. Because irony is the only language that lets you say the truth while pretending you're joking. The doomer is not someone who gave up. The doomer is someone who grieved something. And that is a profoundly lonely place to live. You learn to perform normalcy like a second language. You show up. You function. But somewhere underneath the functioning, there is a self who has already done the math and knows what the answer is, and has had to find a way to live with that answer every single day, without a map, without a community. Without anyone saying, yes, I see it too, and I'm still here. Here's what that looks like when it grows up with you. You find yourself unable to make plans to far into the future. Not because you're irresponsible, but because something in you refuses to pretend certainty you don't feel. 5-year plans feel like fiction. Long-term investments feel like a punchline. The future keeps arriving as a country you can't quite believe you live in. You are inexplicably drawn to things that are beautiful and brief, a sunset, a song that ends too soon, a conversation that accidentally becomes real. You love these things with a ferocity that embarrasses you because part of you is always already mourning them. You have a complicated relationship with hope. You want it. You distrust it. You've been burned by it enough times that optimism feels like a trap someone laid for you. And yet, something in you keeps almost falling for it anyway. You feel guilty for laughing. Like enjoyment is somehow intellectually dishonest given everything you know. Like happiness is a form of complicity. And perhaps most painfully, you have, at times, pushed people away not out of coldness, but out of protection. Because it is terrifying to love something in a world you believe is fragile. Because attachment, for someone who sees endings everywhere, is an act of extraordinary courage. These are not character flaws. These are the footprints of a psyche that tried to protect itself from loss. By refusing to fully arrive. Now here is the part nobody gets to. What if the Doomer worldview isn't a malfunction? What if it's a style of consciousness that carries, beneath its darkness, an unusual and undervalued gift? The person who has already reckoned with impermanence doesn't need the world to be permanent to love it. They have already done the hardest philosophical work most people avoid their entire lives. They have sat with the fact of endings and found, somehow, reasons to continue anyway. That is not nihilism. That is a kind of secular faith. Quieter and stranger and more honest than the performed optimism that passes for mental health. The philosopher Albert Camus wrote that one must imagine Sisyphus happy. Not because the boulder doesn't exist. Not because the hill isn't real. But because the absurd, fully faced, fully owned, becomes the ground of a different kind of freedom. A freedom that doesn't require the lie of guaranteed outcomes. The Doomer who has made peace with the boulder is not broken. They are, in a very specific and underrated sense, free. Think about what it actually means to find beauty inside a worldview that doesn't promise you beauty. Most people's happiness is borrowed. Contingent. Resting on the assumption that things will be okay. That the systems will hold. That the people they love will stay. That the story will resolve the way stories are supposed to. That happiness is load-bearing. Pull out the assumption, and it collapses. But the person who has already pulled out the assumption, who has already stared into the version of the future that doesn't resolve cleanly, and who still wakes up and finds the morning coffee worth making, who still feels the pull of music, and the warmth of a good conversation, who still, despite everything, notices something beautiful. In the wreckage of a complicated world, that person has found something different. Not happiness as reward. Not joy as a product of good circumstances. But something older and stranger. Something the Stoics called amor fati. The love of what is, not what should be. The willingness to say yes to the exact texture of the life you have. Including its darkness, including its uncertainty, including its irreversible losses. This is not passive. It is an act of tremendous psychological strength, dressed in the clothing of resignation. Because it is easy to be happy when things are good. It is another thing entirely, quieter, harder, more earned, to find something worth loving. In a world you have looked at honestly and not looked away from. You don't need to stop seeing what you see. You don't need to trade your clarity for comfort, your honesty for optimism. Your complicated grief for a simpler, more socially acceptable story about the future. What you might need is permission to let both things be true at once. The world is exactly as fragile as you think it is. And the coffee is still warm. And somewhere, someone is making something beautiful out of materials that should have been useless. And you are still here, still noticing, still carrying the strange weight of caring. Even when it looks from the outside like detachment, like irony, like elegant despair. It is not emptiness. It is love wearing the only armor it could find. The Doomer path to happiness is not the one that pretends the path is safe. It is the one walked by people who saw exactly how unsafe it was and kept walking anyway. Not because they believed in the destination, but because, somewhere in the walking itself, they found the only thing that was ever really real, the moment, the motion, the strange, stubborn, unjustifiable act of being alive and present in a world you did not ask for, and cannot fix, and finding, in that exact situation, something that almost feels like enough.